A black boy is humiliated by his teacher in front of the class, shamed for something trivial. The teacher, assuming he's just another student to belittle, never expects what happens next. When the boy's father walks in, everything changes. What the teacher doesn't know is that the boy's father is someone with real power and influence. In a shocking twist, the teacher's world comes crashing down. Stay tuned to see how the tables are flipped and how karma strikes in the most unexpected way. The bell rang, signaling the end of another long day at school. The students shuffled out of the classroom, eager to leave behind another day of lectures and assignments. Elijah, a quiet, intelligent black boy, lingered in the back of the classroom, gathering his things. He had always kept to himself, focusing on his studies and doing his best to stay under the radar. Unfortunately, his teacher, Mr. Thompson, seemed to have it out for him from the start. Mr. Thompson was one of those teachers who favored certain students, dismissing others based on personal biases. Elijah had been on the receiving end of Mr. Thompson's unfair treatment for months, his every answer scrutinized, his every mistake amplified. Today, however, things reached a boiling point. Elijah had raised his hand to ask a simple question about the lesson, but instead of offering help, Mr. Thompson sneered at him, accusing him of being disruptive. "Not everything's about you, Elijah," Mr. Thompson snapped, his voice laced with contempt. The class grew quiet as Elijah sat back, trying to keep his frustration in check. The other students, some of them sympathetic, others too afraid to speak up, exchanged glances, but Elijah didn't respond. He had learned long ago that speaking out only made things worse. He had hoped things would change, but the treatment only got worse with time. Every day felt like a test of endurance, but Elijah wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. Unbeknownst to Mr. Thompson, though, Elijah wasn't just any student. He came from a family with deep roots in the community, with connections and power far beyond the classroom. But for now, Elijah sat silently, enduring the injustice, unaware that his life was about to change drastically. The day had started like any other, but it wasn't long before Mr. Thompson singled Elijah out again. During a history lesson, the teacher asked a question about a particular historical event. Elijah, who had been paying attention and had the correct answer, raised his hand eagerly. He knew the answer, but it was clear that Mr. Thompson wasn't interested in giving him a chance to speak. Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed as he looked over at Elijah. "Yes, Elijah," he said, but there was an edge to his voice. Elijah gave his answer, but before he could finish, Mr. Thompson cut him off. "That's not what I asked. You're just trying to show off again, aren't you?" The class fell silent as Elijah, stunned, tried to comprehend what just happened. "What do you mean, Mr. Thompson?" Elijah asked, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "I'm just answering your question." But Mr. Thompson wasn't having it. "I don't need your attitude. You think you're the only one who can get things right? Some of us work hard for a living, Elijah, unlike you." The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some of them whispering to one another. Elijah could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't respond. He knew if he defended himself, it would only make the situation worse. "Just sit down, Elijah. You're distracting the class. I've had enough of you today," Mr. Thompson snapped, turning his back on him. Elijah's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of the room on him, and though he was hurt, he stayed quiet. This wasn't the first time Mr. Thompson had treated him this way, but today felt different. Elijah wanted to stand up for himself, but part of him was afraid of what would happen if he did. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and, in his mind, powerless in the face of a teacher's authority. Elijah's day only grew worse. Mr. Thompson continued to berate him throughout the class, making snide remarks every time Elijah tried to participate. His comments were thinly veiled insults, cutting deeper than the teacher realized. Elijah tried to focus on his work, but the humiliation was becoming unbearable. He had reached his breaking point, and he needed to get out of there. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Elijah gathered his things slowly. His mind was racing with anger, frustration, and confusion. He wanted to speak up, but something held him back. What good would it do? Who would listen? When he exited the classroom, Elijah didn't head straight for his locker like usual. Instead, he headed toward the school office. He needed to leave. He couldn't be there anymore. The hurt and shame from Mr. Thompson's words were too much to bear. He felt small, invisible, and helpless. But as he stood in front of the office, something held him back. He wasn't sure if he could take another day of this systematic humiliation. Maybe it was time for things to change. Elijah took a deep breath, straightened his back, and turned toward the hallway, feeling more determined with each step. He would speak up, but he wouldn't do it alone. He had to talk to his father. He had to tell him what was happening. What Elijah didn't know was that his father was already well aware of the situation. Though he hadn't told his son, his father had been watching from the sidelines, knowing that Elijah was strong enough to fight his battles on his own. But now it was time to step in. As Elijah sat quietly at lunch, his father walked into the school office. He had already called ahead, and the staff knew who he was. Elijah's father wasn't just any parent. He was a prominent community leader, a respected lawyer, and someone with significant influence. The teachers and administrators respected him. His name carried weight. The moment Elijah's father stepped into the school office, the entire atmosphere changed. The secretary, who had been annoyed at Elijah's constant visits, now smiled and greeted him respectfully. "Mr. Taylor, it's a pleasure to have you here today." "Thank you," Elijah's father said, his voice calm and confident. "I'm here to speak with the principal about a situation that has been brought to my attention." Elijah's father didn't waste time. He made it clear that he had received a report of how his son had been treated, and he wasn't pleased. The principal, nervous about the unexpected visit, agreed to meet him immediately. Elijah's father walked into the principal's office with an air of authority. He was not a man who took injustice lightly, and he made it clear from the very beginning that the situation with Mr. Thompson had gone too far. He wasn't here to apologize for Elijah or to ask for special treatment. He was here to demand accountability. "Mr. Thompson's behavior towards my son is unacceptable. I expect a full investigation into this matter, and I will not allow it to be swept under the rug," Elijah's father stated firmly. The principal shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew who Elijah's father was, but he was unsure how to handle this. He had seen Mr. Thompson as a solid teacher, someone who was popular among the staff. But now, the principal could see that things were going to get much more complicated. "I will look into this immediately, Mr. Taylor," the principal said, attempting to calm the situation. "We take these allegations seriously. I trust you will," Elijah's father responded, "and I expect to hear from you soon." As Elijah's father left the office, he made one thing clear to the principal. No one, especially his son, would be made to feel inferior in this school. Mr. Thompson would be held accountable for his actions. The boy had stood up, but now his father was stepping in to finish what had begun. The following morning, the school was buzzing with an undercurrent of tension. Elijah had returned to class, but his father's words still hung in the air. The principal had promised a thorough investigation into Mr. Thompson's actions, but for now, Elijah was back in the classroom. He wasn't sure what to expect when he walked in, but he was determined to stay calm and focused. His mind was set on one thing: standing up for himself. As he entered the classroom, his heart skipped a beat when he saw Mr. Thompson at the front, scribbling on the board as if nothing had happened. Elijah's father had made it clear that there would be consequences, but the teacher seemed unbothered, as though he didn't even realize the gravity of what was coming. Mr. Thompson glanced up as Elijah walked to his seat. His eyes narrowed slightly, and for a brief moment, Elijah could see a flicker of discomfort in the teacher's gaze. But then, Mr. Thompson quickly recovered. Dismissing the feeling as if it were nothing, he continued with the lesson, acting as if the previous day's incident had been forgotten. But it hadn't been forgotten by Elijah. His mind was sharp, focused. He sat through the lesson trying to maintain his composure, though his frustration continued to build with every passing minute. Mr. Thompson's words, his snide remarks, his constant dismissals, Elijah could feel the weight of it all. It wasn't until the end of the class, when Mr. Thompson once again called Elijah out in front of the other students, that the confrontation reached its peak. "Elijah," Mr. Thompson said, his voice dripping with condescension, "perhaps you'd like to share with the class how you plan to redeem yourself after your little outburst yesterday." The class fell silent, all eyes turning toward Elijah. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the sting of humiliation that Mr. Thompson was trying to impose on him once more. But Elijah wasn't going to let it slide this time. He stood up, his voice steady, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mr. Thompson," Elijah said, his voice clear and unwavering, "I've had enough of this treatment. You've made it clear that you don't respect me because of who I am, and I'm not going to sit here and let you bully me anymore." There was a brief moment of silence. The other students, who had been quiet up until now, exchanged surprised glances. Mr. Thompson looked taken aback, clearly not expecting this kind of defiance from Elijah. "You're out of line, Elijah," Mr. Thompson snapped. "You're making a scene. Just sit down, and we can move on." But Elijah didn't sit down. Instead, he stood tall, facing the teacher with newfound strength. "You don't get to treat me like this anymore," he said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "And I'm not the only one you've been treating this way. You've been doing this to other students, too. It's time you were held accountable for your actions." The room was so still that it almost felt like the walls were holding their breath. Elijah's words had struck a chord. He had made it clear that he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for everyone who had been mistreated by Mr. Thompson's prejudice. The weight of Elijah's courage hung in the air as he stood his ground. But just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, the door to the classroom swung open, and the principal stepped inside. Behind him was Elijah's father, a tall, commanding figure who immediately took control of the room with his presence. The entire class froze as Elijah's father walked to the front of the room, his eyes fixed on Mr. Thompson. "Mr. Thompson," Elijah's father said, his voice calm but full of authority, "I believe we need to have a serious conversation about your behavior toward my son." The color drained from Mr. Thompson's face. He had been caught off guard, and now the reality of the situation hit him. He had assumed Elijah was just another student, one he could push around, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. Mr. Thompson began, but his words faltered. He hadn't expected Elijah's father to show up in person. "You humiliated my son yesterday, Mr. Thompson," Elijah's father continued, his voice steady but firm. "And you've been treating him, and others, with disdain for far too long. This is not acceptable, and it's time for you to face the consequences." The teacher stammered, clearly shaken. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just what?" Elijah's father cut him off, making assumptions based on his race, treating him unfairly without any reason other than your own biases. "Your actions have consequences, Mr. Thompson." Elijah watched as Mr. Thompson's arrogance crumbled. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Elijah's father wasn't just a concerned parent. He was a man with authority, someone who commanded respect, and he had come to make sure that justice was served. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the school district," Elijah's father added, his voice unwavering. "This behavior can't continue. Not in my son's classroom, and not in any classroom." Mr. Thompson stood there, his face flushed with humiliation. He had underestimated Elijah, and now he was facing the consequences of his own actions. There was no way out for him. Elijah's father turned to his son, his gaze softening. "Elijah, you've done well. I'm proud of you." Elijah nodded, his chest swelling with pride. He had stood up for himself, and his father had backed him up every step of the way. Together, they had made sure that Mr. Thompson's actions would not go unnoticed. The room was silent as Elijah's father turned to leave, but not before giving Mr. Thompson one final look. "I expect this matter to be resolved quickly," he said, his voice final. With that, the principal and Elijah's father left the room, leaving Mr. Thompson to face the consequences of his actions. The students, who had watched the entire exchange, began to whisper among themselves, knowing that things would never be the same again. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of Elijah's stand against Mr. Thompson were felt throughout the school. What had initially seemed like a small confrontation turned into a full-blown scandal. News of the altercation spread like wildfire, and soon everyone was talking about the incident. Students, teachers, and even parents began to take notice of the shocking revelation about the teacher's bias. But there was much more to the story than just Mr. Thompson's behavior. As Elijah's father had promised, the complaint was filed, and the school administration had no choice but to take it seriously. The investigation began, and it didn't take long for the truth to surface. It turned out that Elijah's experience wasn't an isolated incident. Mr. Thompson's history of discriminatory actions was uncovered, and several other students came forward, detailing similar experiences with the teacher's unfair treatment. His actions were no longer a personal failure. They were a reflection of a broader issue within the school. The school board called for an emergency meeting, and the situation quickly escalated into a full-blown crisis for the administration. They had been unaware of the extent of Mr. Thompson's behavior, and now they were forced to face the truth about their failure to address it. The investigation revealed a pattern of racial bias, with Mr. Thompson singling out students of color and treating them unfairly, while giving preferential treatment to white students. His behavior was not only unprofessional, it was in direct violation of the school's policies on diversity and inclusivity. Elijah's father, as promised, had been actively involved in the investigation. He had made it clear from the beginning that this wasn't just about his son. It was about fixing a broken system. While Elijah's courage had been the spark that ignited the conversation, it was his father's influence and determination that pushed the school to take real action. The parents, teachers, and even students who had been silent before began to speak out, rallying behind Elijah and his family, demanding that change be made. As the investigation continued, the teacher was placed on administrative leave, pending further review. But it wasn't just Mr. Thompson who was under scrutiny. The school administration was also being held accountable for not addressing the issues sooner. The district issued an apology to Elijah and his family, acknowledging their failure to protect Elijah from the mistreatment he had faced in the classroom. The apology was a start, but Elijah's father knew that real change would take time. He didn't want the school to just sweep the issue under the rug. He wanted the system to change, to ensure that no student would ever face the same kind of bias again. And that's exactly what happened. Elijah's father worked closely with the school district, advocating for new training programs for teachers, anti-racism workshops, diversity training, and better reporting systems for incidents of discrimination were implemented. The school board committed to reviewing their hiring practices, making sure that all staff members were not only qualified, but also committed to fostering an inclusive environment. These were the kinds of changes that would ensure Elijah's experience was not repeated. But there was one more twist to the story: the community's response. Word had spread about the family's courage, and Elijah's actions were being hailed as a victory not just for him, but for every student who had faced discrimination in silence. The local media picked up the story, and soon Elijah and his father were being invited to speak at town halls, school events, and even rallies. Elijah became an unlikely hero, someone who had stood up not just for himself, but for others who had been treated unjustly. For Elijah, this was all surreal. He had never imagined that his simple act of speaking out in class would snowball into something so much bigger. He was just trying to get through school, trying to fit in and learn. But through his father's support and his own courage, he had sparked a movement for fairness. The boy who had once sat quietly, feeling powerless, was now a symbol of hope and resilience for his peers. At the heart of it all was Elijah's father, whose calm but unyielding determination had brought about real change. He had always believed that his son had the power to make a difference, but now he saw the truth of it. Elijah's actions had caused a shift, not just in the classroom, but in the entire school system. The fight wasn't over, but they had won the first battle. And for Elijah, the most powerful part of this journey wasn't the recognition, the speeches, or even the reforms. It was the knowledge that he had fought for what was right. His voice had been heard, and it had made a difference. As time passed, the school began to transform in ways that were once unimaginable. The reforms sparked by Elijah's courage didn't just impact his own experience. They changed the educational environment for every student who walked through those doors. Mr. Thompson, once a respected teacher in the eyes of many, was dismissed from his position, but the larger focus now shifted toward accountability and ensuring that such behavior would never be tolerated again. The school district's decision to implement mandatory anti-racism training for teachers set the stage for an ongoing effort to create a more inclusive and supportive educational environment. Elijah's return to school was a quieter one. The other students, who had witnessed the events unfold, had seen firsthand the power of standing up against injustice. Many of them had been too afraid to speak out when they witnessed Elijah's mistreatment. But now they felt emboldened. Elijah's bravery had shown them that they, too, could demand respect and fairness, even in the face of authority. As the weeks went by, Elijah found that his relationships with his teachers and classmates began to improve. The teachers, many of whom had been unaware of the racial biases that had existed in their classrooms, began to approach their students with a new perspective. They understood now the importance of fostering an environment where all students felt seen, heard, and respected. Elijah had always been a bright student, but now his classmates saw him as a leader. His quiet strength and resolve had earned him respect, and the school began to feel like a safer place for everyone. He no longer felt the weight of unfair assumptions or the sting of unjust punishment. The feeling of being mistreated by those in power still lingered, but it was no longer something that controlled his every move. His father's involvement didn't stop with the reforms at school. The case had brought attention to the wider issues of racial bias in schools and other institutions. Elijah's father used his platform as a well-respected figure in the community to push for systemic change. He spoke at local events, addressing the need for diversity in education and advocating for policies that would hold teachers accountable for their actions. His work extended beyond his son's case. He became a champion for all students who had faced similar injustices. Elijah's own growth over the course of this journey was remarkable. He went from being a quiet, reserved student to someone who recognized his own power and ability to effect change. He realized that standing up for what was right wasn't just about making noise. It was about using your voice to inspire others to do the same. The injustice he faced was painful, but it ultimately strengthened him. It gave him a sense of purpose, knowing that his actions had sparked a larger conversation, one that needed to happen in every school across the country. For Elijah's mother, the experience was bittersweet. She had always supported her son, but seeing him face such discrimination had been heartbreaking. She had never wanted him to have to fight so hard for respect. But watching him step up and speak out, watching him take on the world with such dignity and courage, filled her with pride. She knew that this experience would shape him into someone who would continue to fight for what was right, not just for himself, but for others who had been silenced by systems of injustice. The teacher's dismissal was just the beginning of the story. The real victory came in the form of the systemic change that followed. Elijah's courage became a catalyst for a broader discussion about the way schools and institutions treated students, particularly those from marginalized communities. The story didn't just end with the teacher losing his job. It created a ripple effect that stretched far beyond the school walls, leading to changes in policies, attitudes, and practices. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of student-led advocacy groups. These groups, created in response to Elijah's story, empowered students to speak out against unfair treatment, to create safe spaces for all students, and to foster inclusivity. Elijah, who had once felt invisible, now became a symbol of strength for students who felt silenced. He was involved in the creation of these groups, using his experience to guide others who faced the same challenges. For Elijah's father, the fight was far from over. He continued to push for further reforms, not only in the education system, but in all areas of society where racial injustice persisted. He used his platform to speak about the importance of fair treatment, dignity, and respect for all people, regardless of their background. He had been fighting for change long before this incident, but now he saw the direct impact his work had on his son and the community. In the end, the story of Elijah and his father is a testament to the power of standing up against injustice, the importance of speaking out, and the impact of holding those in power accountable. Elijah's courage and his father's unwavering support were the driving forces behind the change that took place, but it was the broader community's willingness to listen, learn, and adapt that ensured lasting change. The moral of this story is clear. Change doesn't happen because we accept the status quo. It happens when we challenge it, when we stand up for what's right, and when we use our voices to make sure that everyone is treated with respect and fairness. Elijah may have been just one student, but his actions sparked a movement that will continue to inspire future generations. Elijah's journey, though filled with hardship, became a beacon of hope for others who had faced similar injustices. Through his courage and his father's unwavering support, They were able to not only hold one teacher accountable, but also spark systemic change within the entire school system. This story shows us that even in the face of discrimination, standing up for what's right can make all the difference. Elijah's courage wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for all students who have ever been made to feel inferior based on their race. What do you think? Have you ever had to stand up against discrimination or unfair treatment? How did you handle it? Share your stories with us in the comments below. We want to hear how you fought for what's right and made a difference in your own life. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more powerful stories about resilience, justice, and standing up against the odds. We believe that every voice matters, and together we can create a world where everyone is treated with fairness and respect. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with more incredible stories that challenge injustice and inspire change.